Good morning, everyone. This morning, I'd like to share with you the national policy on biological diversity and how it relates to protected area management. Saya daripada ERE, bukan NRE. NRE itu ministry. So, I'm just a consultant to NRE. So, soalan senang-senang saya jawab, soalan susah you can ask the ministry to jawab lah. Any of you have heard of the national policy before? Yang ada yang tak pernah dengar? Ada yang tak pernah dengar? This is a new policy. Semua pernah dengar? Okay. So this policy took about 2 years to formulate, daripada 2014 sampai 2016, and it went through a quite intensive consultation with stakeholders. We had a lot of workshops, a lot of meetings, and so on. It was presented to the cabinet and approved, launched by the Prime Minister in February this year. So early this year, this was launched. You can get a copy of this. You can download from the ministry's website. Ataupun if you go to the ministry, you can get a hard copy free. Okay? So if you go to Putrajaya, drop by NRE, collect a copy for yourself. Secara ringkas, this policy, which will guide biodiversity management for the next 10 years, in a nutshell, kalau saya ringkaskan polisi ini dalam satu slide sahaja, the main message is biodi is our shared heritage, it's our shared responsibility. Warisan bersama, tanggungjawab bersama. In this policy, it talks about engaging and empowering all stakeholders. Kita kena libatkan semua orang because government alone can never achieve the objectives of the policy. We must address all sectors of the economy. We cannot just look at protected areas and ignoring everything else because what happens outside affects our protected areas. And we must raise awareness and strengthen capacity of all stakeholders in order to protect our ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity and use them wisely. So in this policy, there are 5 goals, 17 targets, and 57 actions. I won't go through all. Nanti, if I go through all, you'll be here for the whole day. Yeah? I'll just focus on key points. If you want to read the entire policy, you can download the document. The 5 goals, 5 matlamat utama. There are 5 goals. The first goal is to empower and harness the commitment of all stakeholders. This policy is very much about people. Government alone can never achieve the objectives of the policy. So kita kena libatkan masyarakat tempatan, sektor swasta, pihak NGO, academia, and so on. So it's all about engaging stakeholders. And if everybody cannot get together, we cannot protect our biodiversity. Goal number 2 is about reducing pressures. Maksud di sini ialah animals and plants, you leave them alone, they are fine. We need to manage the pressure from outside. Agriculture expansion, infrastructure, township, fishing, these are all pressure from outside. So the goal number 2 is how to manage the pressures on biodiversity. Goal number 3 is what we always do, to protect ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. This is our traditional work, where we look after elephants, we look after our forests. Goal number 4 is making sure the benefits from biodiversity is equitably accrued to everyone. And lastly, the goal number 5 is to strengthen the capacity of all stakeholders. Because if our capacity is weak, we cannot manage biodiversity. So these are the 5 goals, ataupun 5 matlamat utama. Goal number 1, which is about people. Under goal number 1, it talks about raising awareness, empowering local communities, promoting community conserved areas, strengthening NGOs or civil society, working together with the private sector, and improving stakeholder participation. It's all about people. How do we work together? And goal number 1 talks about how can all stakeholders work together to protect biodiversity. And some of the key points under goal number 1 is a 10-year communication awareness program to raise awareness of BioD, to expand the Rakan Alam Sekitar program, which is already existent, but to strengthen it, to establish a parliamentary environmental caucus. At the moment, all the YBs and the politicians are not really involved. So this calls for establishing a parliamentary committee on environment. Because all of us can plan whatever we like, but end of the day, if the politicians are not aware, so nothing gets done. So this calls for establishing a parliamentary committee on environment. What Ms. Gan raised just now, this policy says that we will establish a policy and legal framework to enable indigenous and local communities to be involved in BioD and protected areas. We want to strengthen indigenous people and local community monitoring program. Macam in Sabah and Sarawak, you have the honorary wildlife warden. This policy calls for strengthening this. We want to have national awards to recognize indigenous and local communities. There are many indigenous people and local communities doing great work in protecting BioD. The policy says there will be a national award system. To support NGOs, there are many NGOs working in Malaysia, and the policy recognizes and will support NGO activities. And finally, under Goal 1, there will be a National Biodiversity Roundtable. This is a big committee involving NGOs, private sector, local communities, and academia to help the government in implementing and monitoring this policy. So, goal number 1 is all about stakeholders working together. And I think many of the issues that Ms. Gan raised about involvement of local communities are being addressed under goal 1. Goal number 2 is about reducing pressure from outside. And under goal 2, it talks about issues like mainstreaming BioD, adapting best management practices for logging, fisheries, and agriculture, promoting greener tourism, and so on. So when I talk about reducing pressure, maksud saya ialah your protected areas, if you leave them alone, they are fine. We need to worry about the pressure from outside. Logging, fisheries, agriculture expansion, townships, roads coming in, poaching, these are all pressure. And we cannot manage our protected areas if we don't address the pressure. And very often the pressure is di bawah bidang kuasa orang lain. Agriculture expansion comes under different ministry. Fishing license comes under different ministry. So addressing pressure, we need to deal with other agencies. We cannot just deal with ourselves. And some of the key programs or action points and projects identified under goal 2 are a policy framework for making sure BioD is captured into national and state planning. At the moment, it's very ad hoc. Biodiversity must be given due recognition in terms of economic value, government city. The government green procurement system. I don't know if you're familiar. At the moment, the federal government has a policy on green procurement, and there is a target by 2020, 20% of all government procurement will be green. And there's also the policy also supports more responsible tourism and support for indigenous and local communities to be involved in tourism. So goal 3 is the work that we always do, is to safeguard our ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity. So under goal 3, these are some of the areas that are addressed, expanding protected areas, restoring degraded areas, restored corridors, and so on. So some of the key programs identified in the policy to strengthen the PA network with focus on underrepresented ecosystems. Underrepresented means, like, for example, wetlands are underrepresented, limestone hills, and so on. So there's a lot of focus on underrepresented ecosystem. Over the next few years, the ministry will develop a framework for CCAs. There's community conserved areas. At the moment, there's no policy direction on CCAs. This will be developed over the next few years. Framework for national PA system, that is being done now under this project. there's also a drive to protect urban biodiversity. People think in the cities there's no biodiversity, but actually in the city areas there is biodiversity, and the policy calls for protecting urban biodiversity. Then you talk about strengthening CFS, HOB, CTI, and strengthening enforcement and so on. Goal number 4 is on ABS and traditional knowledge. Some of the key action points are institutional framework for ABS. The law also is still at the draft stage. Hopefully the law is passed. Malaysia to accede to the Nagoya Protocol and to enhance our capacity. And there's a lot of provision for recognizing customary laws and traditional knowledge. And goal number 5 is on strengthening the capacity of everyone, not only government, but also strengthening capacity of NGOs, local communities, so that everybody can be involved in managing biodiversity. So it talks about strengthening agencies, improving legislation, and so on. And some of the key points under Goal 5, the National Biodiversity Center will be operational by 2018. So this is a new agency to coordinate biodiversity management for the country. Sabah dengan Sarawak dah ada. This is at the national level. This thing called MEXCO. MEXCO is the meeting of ministers and EXCO members in charge of environment. Every state has its Semenanjung has an EXCO member in charge of environment. Di Sabah dengan Sarawak, you have ministers. So previously these people don't meet and talk. So now there is there are regular meetings for MEXCO, so that all state EXCO members and ministers sit together to discuss issues pertaining to environment and biodiversity. State level biodiversity strategy, following from the national policy, every state will develop its own state level biodiversity strategy. At the moment, cuma Sabah sahaja yang ada, other states don't have. So as part of this policy, each state will develop its own state level biodiversity strategy. The policy also calls for review of all marine related legislation. So at the moment, the policy recognizes when it comes to marine parks and marine biodiversity, there are a lot of gaps and overlaps between marine, land, fisheries, and so on. So it calls for a review of marine legislation. To scale up the National Conservation Trust Fund. At the moment, National Conservation Trust Fund already exists, has 10 million ringgit in seed money, but 10 million ringgit is not enough and it has to be scaled up. So secara ringkas, the policy is like this. You have 5 goals, 17 targets and 57 actions. For each action, there are key indicators, lead agency and key partners. And the coordination platform is like this. There is the Majlis Biodiversity Negara, which is chaired by the Deputy Prime Minister. And then there is a National Steering Committee for the policy, which is chaired by the KSU of the Ministry of Natural Resources. And there are working groups under the steering committee. There is a National Biodiversity Roundtable. So yang di tengah-tengah ni, this is the federal government. So on this side is the private sector and NGOs. There is National Biodiversity Roundtable, which is led by private sector or NGOs, which will provide input to the steering committee. And on this side is the state. So there will be a state steering committee for the policy, as well as the MEXCO, when the state ministers and state EXCO members meet and they report to the National Biodiversity Council. This is how the coordination will be done. So this policy, how is it different? In a nutshell, first, I think it moves away from being federal government centric. Kalau policy yang lain is very heavy on federal government. Federal government do this, federal government do that. So this policy moves away from that thinking. It seeks to engage all stakeholders. It calls greater role for NGOs and local communities, greater role for state government. Sebab biodiversity is actually a state matter. Hutan, air is state matter. So we need state government to play a greater role. So it is, like I said, it moves away from being a federal government centric to give a greater role for all other stakeholders. It promotes mainstreaming, it talks about external pressure, it addresses all the new issues, like biosafety, ABS, and so on. And it helps Malaysia to address the Aichi biodiversity target. And also, this new policy has time-bound targets, very clear targets when to achieve, and key indicator which was absent in the old policy. It has lead agencies for every action. It has a better coordination mechanism, and a resource mobilization plan is being prepared. But without money, nothing gets done. So that is the policy roughly. So what does the policy say specifically about protected areas? Just now I talked about every other issue, but in terms of protected areas alone, you remember we have 5 goals, 5 goals and 17 targets. So protected areas are addressed in different parts of the policy. For example, in goal 1, under target 2, it talks about recognizing and empowering indigenous people and local communities to be involved in protected area management. It talks about getting private sector to collaborate in protected area management. We have some indicators. By 2021, a policy and legal provisions to empower indigenous people and local communities will be developed. At the moment, there is no policy framework. Local community involvement is very ad hoc. So we hope by 2021, the policy framework will be ready. And by 2025, the target is collaborative project with NGOs will be double compared to what is there now. Lepas tu in target 3, for example, it talks about mainstreaming and protected areas. So some of the issues relevant to protected areas are making sure that these are protected in statutory land use plans, making sure infrastructure planning doesn't cut into protected areas, and so on. And we have targets, we have indicators. For example, if you look at this, by 2018, there's another policy framework. 2020, all states have identified hotspot. By 2025, 50 tourism sites are certified under the GSTC. Lepas tu, we have target 6, 7, and 8. It's all about protected areas and ecosystems. The policy calls for expansion of protected areas, both terrestrial and marine, calls for establishing transboundary areas, particularly those relevant to the CFS as well as the HOB. A national master plan for freshwater sanctuaries. At the moment, our freshwater are very weak. We don't have protected areas for river system and freshwater fish. We have a lot of hutan, we have a lot of marine, but freshwater, we are very weak, so it calls for establishing a master plan for freshwater sanctuaries. Develop CCA, Community Conserved Area, as an important part of a PA network. Promote partnerships and co-management with indigenous communities and local communities. This is what Ms. Gunn raised, that at the moment we don't have a formal system, so this policy will develop this formal system that to promote partnership and co-management with local communities. Framework PA system is being done now. Ensure that all PAs have management plan. Currently some have, some don't have. So under this policy over the next 10 years, all PAs should have management plans and so on. Key indicators. This is what has been agreed by the federal government. By 2025, 20% of the total land area of the country are protected as PAs, and 10% of our marine area. We think 20% is not a problem, but this 10% might be a problem, the marine, but we'll see how it goes. By 2025, the number or size of community conserved area is double compared to what is there now. So there's a lot of emphasis on indigenous people and local communities. The framework has been established. I think this will be done. At least 10 primary corridors under CFS have been implemented. and also 3 corridors under the Heart of Borneo program. Lepas tu, under stakeholder capacity building in targets 15, 16, and 17, besides strengthening capacity agencies, there's also the formation of biod units or centers in all Semenanjung states. But in Sabah Sarawak, you already have. This is for all states Semenanjung. What are the indicators? By 2018, the National Biod Center is operational. At the moment, there is a core team that has been formed. They hope to get it operational by 2018. By 2018, at least 5 states have formulated state-level strategies. By 2020, review of all national and state policies, legislation, and institutions related to marine biod is completed. And by 2025, 10 more sites are accorded international recognition, either Ramsar or UNESCO World Heritage Site and so on. And I think this is achievable. So my last 2 slides, ladies and gentlemen. The national policy actually provides a good framework for us to improve the protected area management. So if you read the document, there's actually a lot of provisions for us to improve our protected areas. But one of the key things here is we need to start thinking in terms of multi-stakeholder partnership. Government alone can never become effective. So we need partnership with NGOs, we need partnership with local communities, we need partnership with private sector. And the national policy actually, if you read the policy, it promotes this multi-stakeholder partnership in almost every part of the policy. And I think in Malaysia, we have actually many good stories. If you look, for example, the Ramsar, the Kota Kinabalu wetlands, which is a Ramsar site, is managed by an NGO. Kuala Selangor Nature Park is managed by an NGO. The Bundu Tuhan Native Reserve is managed by local communities. So there are many already success stories, and we can expand this. But to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, my last word is this. We need to humanize protected areas. Because if the rakyat cannot relate to protected areas, if they cannot understand why are you managing the hutan and the animals, if they cannot appreciate the values of this, our protected area will never be safe in the long run. So we need to humanize. I mean, we have to bring people closer to protected areas. We need to make people appreciate, people recognize the importance. There's no point kita jaga hutan dengan kita jaga gajah when the people outside cannot appreciate what we are doing. So therefore, bringing people closer to protected areas is crucial. I think maybe the word humanize is merakyatkan kawasan perlindungan. Bring people closer. Otherwise, if people cannot appreciate, if the rakyat cannot appreciate, the politician cannot appreciate. If the politician cannot appreciate, you're going to lose it. So I think we need to bring people closer to protected areas. I think with that, I'll end here. Thank you very much.